Hey folks, in this video I'm going to show you a demo of how to deploy Redis Server on a $5 DigitalOcean cloud virtual machine with TLS support and password protection. So it's a very simple setup from where you can get started, and then later on you can configure the Redis server and the operating system according to your changing needs. You can also fine tune the configuration for performance for your setup. For example, you would do fine tuning and aim for performance in your production setup compared to a local development setup. Now let's get started. So in DigitalOcean, droplets and virtual machines are the same thing. So we'll be using the term interchangeably. So DigitalOcean has this term called droplet. So it's just a term used by DigitalOcean, similar to how the term EC2 or Elastic Compute Cloud term is used in Amazon Web Services to refer to virtual machines. So I currently have no droplets in my account, which you can see like this using the doctl CLI tool. So, or you can use the DigitalOcean Cloud dashboard. So I have set up doctl tool and authenticated using it. So I'm going to use that. I believe doctl is short for DigitalOcean Control, and it's pretty simple to use. So now I also have a few SSH keys, which you can see like this. So I'm going to be using one of those SSH keys to deploy the droplet or virtual machine. So I'm going to deploy a $5 DigitalOcean droplet, which is a popular droplet or virtual machine in DigitalOcean Cloud. Let's see the configuration, like machine configuration for this droplet. So this is the machine configuration. So you can see the price is $5, and the hourly price is this. So this is a one vCPU, which is virtual CPU, central processing unit, one vCPU and 1 GB RAM virtual machine. So I'm going to use that to deploy the Redis server. So let's start by deploying the droplet itself, the $5 DigitalOcean droplet. So I'm going to do that by doing this. So while this happens, let me also tell you that I'm actually deploying an Ubuntu 20.04 operating system, which is a 64-bit operating system on this droplet. And I'm also deploying this in the Bangalore region, which is a place in India, which is a city in India. And I'm using a particular SSH key. So I'm deploying to Bangalore because Bangalore is like pretty close to the place where I live. I live in Chennai. So the latency to connect to the virtual machine would be very low because the distance is very small between the two regions, which also means that the latency to connect to the Redis on the virtual machine would be very low. So now we have the virtual machine deployed. So we can see it in the list of droplets like this, or list of virtual machines. So you can see it like this. And so now let's SSH into the virtual machine as a root user. So to SSH, I'm going to use the public IP of the virtual machine and then SSH into it. Um, so it looks something like this. So yes, I need to type in my passphrase, which protects the SSH key that I have. Cool. So now we are inside the virtual machine. Now let's install Redis. So I'm going to do that by doing this. So this will add the Redis Labs Redis repository and install Redis. By the way, Redis Labs company has renamed themselves to just Redis. Um, so let's wait for this to install. Cool. So now that this has been installed, Redis is installed, and you'll also notice that the Redis server is already running. I believe this is part of the installation. You can check the Redis server that's running like this. So it's using the systemd service. So systemd service is running your Redis server, like monitoring and running it. Um, And you can see that we are running Redis Server 6.2.6, which you can actually see during the installation, or by doing this, by connecting to the Redis server using Redis CLI, which of course you can do, and doing a ping, you can ping it and check, and then you can check the Redis server version like this. So you have 6.2.6, and you'll also notice this when the installation happens in the logs. So now that we have the Redis server running and we are able to connect to it using the Redis CLI that you just saw, now we can also do one more thing. So I'm going to check if this Redis server is using libc library or gemalloc library for memory allocation using the memory malloc stats command. So memory malloc stats is a Redis command. So looks like it is using gemalloc. So gemalloc is supposed to be better than libc malloc or memory allocation. So it's good to have gemalloc being used. So it's cool that it uses it. So uh, now that we have our Redis server up and running, let's do a password protection for our Redis server. So let's generate a password and use it to like configure and protect our Redis server with password protection. So we have the password generated. So this command can be used to generate a random password. So currently there is no password configured for the default user that we are using. You can see that by doing this. So config get require pass, there is no password. So I'm going to copy this password to set it up. So let's configure a password for the default user like this. So it says OK, so it has been configured. So let's check if it is configured now. Cool. So when I'm trying to connect to the Redis server and trying to get the current password, it says, you need to be authenticated to even check that. Like, I'm not logged in or like authenticated to check that. So it says that authentication is required. You can clearly see that authentication required, no auth. So we have set the password now, right? So it will ask for it. So before we do anything using Redis CLI, to interact with the Redis server, we have to authenticate with the Redis server now because it's password protected now. For this, we will set the Redis CLI auth environment variable so that we don't have to pass the password in the command line using flags or pass it every time we use the Redis CLI tool, which can get pretty tedious. And you can see that this Redis CLI auth environment variable is documented here. Redis CLI auth environment variable as part of the -a flag, which is for password. So let's set this environment variable. So I'm going to do that, and let's check if it is set properly. Redis CLI auth. Okay. So now that that is set, let's check if the password configuration is all good again. Cool. So now we are able to authenticate with Redis using the password in the Redis CLI auth environment variable, and we are able to get the require pass configuration to see if the password configuration is all good. So now that that is configured, let's also quickly rewrite the config to the Redis server config file because so Redis server config file is a static config file that doesn't get changed on the fly unless we forcefully rewrite it using this command. So this is the command to do that. But before we forcefully rewrite, let me show you where this Redis config file is present. So it's present here. So it's present here. You can also notice where it is present by checking the systemctl status Redis server and then checking the systemd file. And this is the systemd file. And if you actually cat the systemd file, you will see that the Redis server is being run using this Redis conf file. So with that, you can actually open up the Redis config file and check if a password is set in this file, but you can see that it is not. Um, so but the reality is that the Redis server is password protected now. It's just that this file has not been updated because it's a static file and it doesn't get changed. So uh, to change this and forcefully rewrite this, we have to use this command. So let me use that. Now we have used it. Let's see if that worked, and let me check again. So now you can see that we have a password here. Um, that worked, right? So now let's follow a similar strategy to do other configurations too. So other configurations would be like, for example, we can set the port number now. Now that the password is set, we can set a port number. So we already have a port number which is 6379, the default one. But let's move on to using a port number other than 6379 for a Redis. Why? So that like when we expose the Redis server to the internet with a public IP, malicious services will actually hit 6379 and other popular ports looking to exploit services like Redis, SSH secure shell server, and other popular server software. So when we expose Redis to the public internet, we have to be careful. So changing the port number can actually reduce it maybe because like if you change the port number to say 56379, when these malicious bots are only checking for 6379, they'll not be able to actually connect to the Redis. But of course, changing the port number, of course, does not prevent the malicious services or bots that are online from port scanning and trying out different protocols to detect what service is running behind the scenes at a given port, which can be a random port like 56379 or something, or a popular default port like 6379. So a better way to prevent attacks on the Redis server would be to use firewalls to allow only some ports to be accessible and only some source IPs to be able to access these ports, and only allow some protocols to be used while communicating to these ports. So for example, in the case of a Redis server, you can think something like allow only port say 56379, which is a random port, allow only my computer's public IP to be able to access the Redis server that I deploy. And in case I deploy an application using the Redis server, maybe provide the IP address of that application also, the public IP of that application. And then allow only TCP protocol communication on this port because Redis uses the Redis protocol, which is on top of the TCP protocol. So if possible, maybe even restrict it to Redis server's Redis protocol, which is short for Redis serialization protocol, and which is based on TCP, like I said. Also, RESP has different versions though, V3 being the latest one, I believe. So ensure that that is taken care of in case you're doing restriction at RESP level, or you can just stop with restriction at TCP level. For now, let's just follow the simple way and not do firewall stuff for now. Let's just set the port number to a random port like 56379. So I'm going to do just that. So this is that. So I've set it, and you can see I get the port, and it's currently 6379, and I set the port to 56379, and then I get it again, but this time I actually use a port number over here, unlike here. If you see, I use the -p flag, which is P is short for port, and I use the new port now because it's already set, and you can get the port and then also rewrite and check the port number. So now if I actually don't use a port, I will get errors. So it's clear that I have to use the port now. So now with the port number and password set, let's see if we can connect to the Redis server from my local machine using the virtual machine's public IP. I'm going to use the doctl command to check the public IP of the virtual machine. You can also use like something like curl if config, something like this, curl if config.me, or use if config command line tool. I don't have it currently installed. Beware that curl if config .me could be collecting the public IP of your virtual machine, I'm not sure how much you can trust it. So they could collect the public IP of your virtual machine to know that it's an online virtual machine on the public internet and could attack you or share the public IP of your virtual machine with someone you don't want to share it with. But yeah, if you have safety measures in place like password configured and firewall also to allow only trusted clients to access the Redis server, I think you're good to go and don't have to worry about things like distributed denial of service attacks or breach attempts by by trying to crack the Redis server password or cracking the Redis password. I'll try to probably cover the firewalls concept and how to protect your Redis server with firewall in another video. But for now, let's move on. So now let's check the connectivity to the Redis server from my local machine. So I'm going to set the password. One sec. I have to check the thing doctl compute droplet list. So I've got the public IP here, and that's the public IP. So so I'm in my local, and I'm going to set the password using the Redis CLI auth environment variable so that Redis CLI uses it. And I'm going to use the public IP and you know do this. So I'm going to do a ping and see if I get pong. Okay, so it doesn't seem to work. So what could be the reason? Hmm. It says connection refused. So let me check if there's any connectivity issues using telnet. So let me do this. Okay, so it says connection refused again. So looks like there's no connectivity. So usually there could be multiple reasons for this. So one reason could be that your Redis server is not running, or maybe the Redis server is running at a different port and you use the wrong port number, or maybe you use the wrong IP address and your Redis server is running at a different IP address. In this case, though IP address and port numbers are right, or maybe the Redis server is running and the port number is and IP is correct in this case, but there is some firewall or network access block in between, refusing the connections. Or the Redis server is running but refusing the connection due to some other reason. So, well, the reason in our case is that by default, Redis server binds and listens only to the loopback network interfaces and listens for connections only from local clients. So that is clients from the virtual machine where the Redis server is deployed. So we need to fix this by binding the Redis server to the public IP network interface or by binding it to all network interfaces of the virtual machine, which could include different kinds of networks apart from the public IP network, which is the internet itself. So be aware of what you're doing, and if you don't know what you're doing, just stick to binding to the public IP address alone, maybe, or public IP address and the loopback addresses. So let's connect back to the virtual machine for now, and let's put in my passphrase. We need to authenticate to the Redis server. So I'm going to use the Redis CLI auth environment variable. Um, and let's actually configure the binding. So now I have actually checked what is the bind configuration. So you can see that it's the loopback network interfaces, this is the loopback network IP for IPv4, so 127.0.0.1, and this is IPv6 loopback network IP. And you can see that I'm setting it to the public IP and also IPv4 and IPv6 loopback network IPs. And again, when I get it, you can see that it's all good. So there is OK, and then finally this. And I also do a config rewrite, and I also check if the Redis conf file is all good. So it's important for the Redis conf file to be good because systemd is using the Redis config file always. to start the Redis server. So in case your Redis server, your machine is shut down and then restarted, the Redis config should have all the configuration that you're doing. Cool. So clearly, like I have currently explicitly set or like bound the Redis server to the public IP and the loopback network interfaces. An alternative would be to use this, but I wouldn't recommend it. So I have not run it. I have used the hash here, if you can see here. So I have not run this, but you can actually use this. So this is to denote that you want to bind to all IPv4 network and IPv6 networks. So I wouldn't recommend that, but that is also an option. Now that we have bound to the network interface associated with the public IP, we can now connect to the Redis server from my local machine. So I'm going to come out of this server and I'm going to check if my Redis CLI auth environment variable is good. It's good. So let's now connect and check ping. Cool. I can do a ping and it says pong. And I can also do things like check the server information and all that. Cool. So now that the connectivity is all good, we can set up TLS support for the Redis server. So for TLS support, I'm going to use Let's Encrypt Certificate Authority. I'm going to use the Let's Encrypt Certificate Authority free certificates and use a demo subdomain. Uh, and the subdomain will be from a domain name that I own through Google Domains. Okay. So first, let me show you how I point the DNS of the subdomain to the Redis server's public IP, and so that like I can prove to Let's Encrypt Certificate Authority that I am actually the owner of the domain name and its records, and hence I'm eligible to get the SSL certificates for the domain name and use it for my Redis server in my Redis server. So I'm going to switch to Google Domains website now. Cool. So let's actually put this in. So I'm gonna create a new record over here. It's a new A record. New A record, and I'm gonna give the name as Redis Server 2, just a dummy name, and I'm gonna give 10 minutes over here. So this would create a name like this: Redis-server-2.hosteddatabase.in. So it's a subdomain name for the domain name hosteddatabase.in. Cool. And this is the IP address that I'm using. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this. Cool. So now that I have done it, I'll come back to my terminal. And so now let's obtain the SSL certificates using a free and open source tool called CertBot, which interacts with Let's Encrypt Certificate Authority APIs and like gets you a certificate. So let's first install CertBot tool, and this has to be done inside the virtual machine that I've created. So let me SSH into the virtual machine now. Okay, passphrase. Cool. So now let me install CertBot. So this will take a moment. Cool. Now we are back, and the CertBot has been installed. So now let's get this SSH certificate. So you do it like this. So it says saving the debug log, enter email address. So this is for renewal and security notices apparently. So I'm just gonna give my email address. So that is my email address, and terms of service. Sure, I've read a bit before, so I'm just gonna leave it. So would you be willing, once you're successfully assured, to share? Yeah, I can share my email address. Please enter the domain names you would like on your certificate. So I'm going to copy the domain name that we had used in our thing. So let me show that. So I'm going to copy this domain name. Cool. And I'm going to put it in the terminal. Awesome. So it's going to request a certificate for that. Cool. So now we have the certificate, and it says certificate is saved at this place, and the private key is also there. So when you request a certificate, you get a SSL certificate is basically a public key certificate, public key. So when you request a certificate, you get the public key and its corresponding private key. So we have the certificate here, and we have the private key here. So it's called the full chain and the private key dot pem. And let's look at this. So we have that. Cool. So we have both of these. So we have the certificate and the private key. So now that we have these two, the SSL certificate and the private key, let's use it to configure the Redis server. So before configuring the certificate and the private key in the Redis server, we need to ensure that the Redis server can access the SSL certificate and the private key. Basically, like it should be able to read it. So the Redis server is currently being run by using the Redis server, Redis user, sorry. So it's being run by the Redis user and has the same access. So the Redis server has the same level of access as the Redis user because the Redis user is what is running the process. So how do I know this? Well, we find it out by checking the systemd service file. So you remember this service file, right? So if I actually do a cat of this, you can see that the user is Redis and the group is Redis. So this is the user and the group that runs the Redis server. Cool. So, but the Redis user does not have access to the SSL certificate and the private key that we just created. How do I know this? Well, I just checked like this. So if you notice, the etc slash let's encrypt directory has all these directories, and our key is basically inside this directory. So you can see Redis server 2, hosted database, and the full chain, the certificate, SSL certificate, and the private key. Here you can see that it has the root user and the root group and others have read, write, execute access on both of these, but this is only at the subdirectory level. But if you dive up and go and see the let's encrypt, if you see the live directory over here, only the root user, the owner, has access, read, write, execute access. The group, the users within the root group, other users within the root group, and other users outside the root group both don't have any other access to this live directory which has all these certificates. So basically the Redis user does not have access to the certificate and the private key that we just created. So we will have to give the access to the Redis user. So let's give the access now. I'm going to do this for that. So I'm just going to use the Redis user and Redis group. So now you can see that this live directory is owned and owned by the Redis user and the Redis group. So now with that change, we have solved the access issue, like permissions issue. So now let's configure the Redis server with the SSL certificate, which is the public key, and also configure the private key. So I'll start with the private key first. Let's set the password before we do anything in the Redis CLI auth environment variable. Cool. Now the configuration is this. So it's called the TLS key file configuration, and we are setting it to use the Redis server 2 private key. And when we get it again, we see that it's all good, and we get OK everywhere. There is no errors. So now, and we also write it to the Redis conf file. So let's do the public key next, which is the SSL certificate. And So now you can see that, so this is the configuration for the SSL certificate. So it's called TLS cert file, and we put the SSL certificate over here, the path of it, and here it's all good. So now that we've configured the Redis server with the SSL certificate and private key, let's disable the TLS auth clients feature now. This feature is usually enabled by default to say that the clients must provide TLS certificates while connecting to the Redis server. Since I'm not going to be creating client certificates for clients while connecting to the Redis server in this video, I'll disable it. So if I don't disable this, it will lead to some errors as it is enabled by default. So I'm just going to go ahead and disable it like this. So we are good with that. So initially it's enabled by default, so I'm going to disable it. And now let's also set the TLS port to enable the TLS feature, and to enable listening at the TLS port. So with that, I have enabled the TLS port. You can also see that, you know, one sec. So currently I'm still using the other port, which is the non-TLS port, but there is also the TLS port enabled now. So I don't want both TLS port and non-TLS port. I want the clients to only use the TLS port and not use the non-secure non-TLS port. So I'm going to disable that. So let's do that. So the port is 56379 and I set it to 0 to disable it. So now that that is disabled, I can't connect to the Redis server using 56379. I will have to use 56380, and I will have to also use hyphen TLS to mention that it's a TLS communication. It's using the TLS like transport layer security. So now if I don't use the TLS flag, it will give me a IO error. So you can see the IO error like this. So you can see an IO error. So if I don't use the TLS flag, so if I use the TLS flag, I get the reply from the Redis server. So this is all good now, and now we can connect to this Redis server from my local using Redis CLI, or I can use other CLI tools. So I'm going to use this CLI tool called Redli. Um, Let me show that. So Redli is another Redis client CLI tool from IBM. So and there are many other CLI tools out there for Redis. So this is just one. So we can use Redli like this, which is a Redis client CLI. So you can see that it is connected to 6.2.6, which is the server version. So I've used Redli, which is and it says TLS, and it says -h, the host, Redis server 2 hosted database.in -a, and then it gives the password over here, and then the port number. And I can do things like info server, ping, pong, and whatnot. So that's all. That's how you can actually connect to the Redis server from the local using TLS. And if you don't use the proper host name, let's see what it says. So let me use the IP address that I had. 1 minute. Let's see if it actually gives an error. So it says, so when I use the IP address, it gives me an error. So cannot validate certificate for this because it does not contain any IP sans. So actually the certificate has been created only for the redis-server-2.hosteddatabase.in domain name. And Let's Encrypt actually does not allow you to create certificates for IP addresses. Well, it's best to actually use the domain name in case your IP address changes and whatnot, and also have proper TLS certificate for the domain name. So with that, you can actually see that there are no certificate validation issues, unlike using public IP. Also, if you actually use a self-signed certificate and not a certificate from a certificate authority like Let's Encrypt, you will have to pass extra things to provide what is the certificate authority certificate and whatnot. So and you can also do the same with Redis CLI. So yeah. So with that, that's all I had to show. So with that, you can actually delete the DigitalOcean droplet in case this was only a test setup for you or something like a proof of concept or a dummy setup. I'm going to delete the DigitalOcean droplet like this. So now that that's deleted, if I list my droplets, you can see, I think it will take a moment for it to get deleted. Yep, it's deleted now. So I don't have any droplets now. So yeah, that's all I had to show for this video. I hope you learned something and let me know your comments in the comments section. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.